Watch it. So I'm Mark McKinnon. I'm the founder of Discovery Publishing Company and the creator of BESM, the fourth edition, as well as all the way back to the first edition and the underlying Tristat system. And with me today is Robin Flanagan. Robin is the creative director of Discovery Publishing. So he does, I always like to say I'm the system guy and Robin's the writing guy. So that's probably the easiest division between the two of us is Robin does a lot of the creative stuff, and I'm mainly a system person. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you again once for coming out. So we do have obviously the Twitch chat. I see that there's a few people in it right now, and we have about 10 people watching the stream. So certainly if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop it in the chat, and we'll certainly get to it. Robert and I are pretty good at filling up space and talking, and we'll talk a little bit about the Kickstarter and BESM and the future BESM and whatnot. We'll fill in the blanks, but if there's any questions, we'll be sure to try to address those as well. So just first, before we get started, just a little bit of reason why we're specifically doing this one tonight, like right now, is we are running the BESM Multiverse Kickstarter, which we're calling it the Multiverse Kickstarter, because that's the kind of the feature product, is the setting world book for BESM, 224 pages, full color. That's the official setting within the cosmic web. But in addition to that book, we also have 3 other expansion products that we're kickstarting at the same time. One of them is Euresia Grave of Heaven, which is a setting source book, again, set within the BESM multiverse, but it's very specific to one world. So Euresia is part of the multiverse. Euresia is the brainchild of S. John Ross. When we did BESM second edition, it was one of the setting books that we did. And whenever we had a chance to kind of buy it from S. John for BESM fourth edition and adapt it for there, we got to compile 20 years of his work and put it into a single volume and place Euresia within the BESM multiverse as kind of one of the inner worlds that we have. And so that's where the second product is. Then we have a pack of BESM multiverse maps, which is a pack of 6 maps that we have, which are all the prime worlds that are featured in the multiverse book. And so they're just gorgeous wall maps, about 2 by 3 feet, that you can place on a table or hang on a wall. Just really nice visual representations of the different worlds and genres. And then the final one is something a little different for us, and certainly for me, is a novel. So this is the first of a trilogy books that we have called A Carrion Gate, which is a lit RPG. If you're not familiar with what a lit RPG novel is, you can certainly look it up online. I won't take all the time to explain it, but basically characters in the book are effectively in a game, and so they have game stats which are related to BESM. You don't need to know anything about BESM to enjoy the novel for what it is. The author of that is Ethan Freckleton, who's not with us tonight, but we're familiar enough with it. We of course talk about it. And then we have an audiobook of the Carrion Gate, which is narrated by Jonathan Sleep, which is a fantastic book. He's probably best known for his Creatures and Casters, Creatures and the Critical Failures is what I know the book series are. Creatures and Caverns, that's what it is. So that's kind of the overall story that he's done. There's, I guess, 9 or 10 volumes that he does the audio for those, and we liked it so much that we brought him in to do the audiobook for Carrion Gate as well. So that's me rambling on and doing a quick introduction just to kind of get things settled up. I'm going to move right into some questions, Robin, if that's all right. These are questions that were posted on Discord. We knew that not everyone could make it to the Twitch live stream and post the questions there, so we did ask people if they had any questions to post in advance. So we'll just jump into those. And one of them is Euresia considered canon in the BESM multiverse? And is it an inner or outer world? And if it is canon, what does it take for an original world to be considered canon? So as I mentioned briefly earlier, yes, Euresia is part of the BESM multiverse. Once we had an opportunity to publish it, we decided to make it a canonical world. And Robin, we decided to put Euresia and make it an inner world connected to Icarus. Now, can you talk a little bit about Icarus and why that makes a good connection for Euresia?
Yeah. Well, Euresia isn't exactly a standard fantasy world, but it is definitely an anime fantasy world. That's John Ross did. I wanted to say a lot of research, but your fandom becomes your research when you're doing this sort of thing. So it was actually really fascinating to look into Eurasia when I was adding it into the Multiverse book. And Icarus being the epic fantasy world, um, your fairy tale meets your One Piece meets your Black Clover kind of setting. Eurasia is kind of just one step off of that, where you've got more your comedic fantasy, but there can be real stakes in Eurasia. The tagline, at least it was a colorful apocalypse, really gets across big things can happen in Eurasia. I mean, you might end up in a life or death Iron Chef contest in Eurasia, because that's the kind of place it is, but it's still this really cool fantasy world. So Icarus was the natural prime world to link Eurasia to.
Yeah, and so I'm just going to quickly interrupt and ask the audience for a moment. I'm just going to change one setting just to see if this might be something helpful. So Robin just talked for a while. You probably heard. I guess I understand that there is an echo whenever Robin is talking, which unfortunately I haven't been able to solve as of now. But I'm going to just change a quick setting to see if that does make any solution changes. So can you just maybe talk a little bit, Robin, about Icarus and what it would mean to, how would you get to Eurasia from Icarus as an inner world versus a prime world?
Well, barring phenomenal skeleton key powers, there are gateways. Gateways. I don't detail a lot of specific gateways because game masters are going to want to place them themselves. But gateways from Icarus to Eurasia would probably be very weird places in Icarus and the least weird places in Eurasia. I remember there's a kingdom in Eurasia that is the whole shtick is it's a super stereotypical fantasy kingdom. That strikes me as a really good place to have a gateway to Icarus, because while Icarus tries to avoid being stereotypical, it's a more traditional fantasy setting. So places that are similar enough are generally places of gateways. The mushroom rings on Prime Earth would be a gateway to Icarus or Aradia. So that would be the easiest way to get from Icarus to Eurasia.
Okay.
How are we doing?
That's good. Thank you. So, yes, thanks very much, RPG Digest, for mentioning that the echoing did improve. So I'm using external mic, and I've just kind of switched over. I'm going to probably just manually switch back and forth a little bit to whenever I know that Robin's going to be talking a little bit more in detail, to give it a hopefully adjust some of the echoing and make maybe a little bit more clear. Again, my apologies, and thanks for tuning in. So back to the question. So we mentioned yes, it is an official world, and yes, it's an inner world. About what does it take to make something an official canonical setting? And part of it is just whether or not we've included it. I mean, one of the things that was really important whenever Robin and I sat down to make the multiverse is we obviously knew early on, back almost 20 years ago, that it was going to be the prime worlds are 6 prime worlds, and then from the prime worlds there were 2 inner worlds that linked from all the prime worlds, so that would be 12-ish inner worlds, and then from there there'd be a layer of outer worlds, and 42 seemed to be a good number to choose given its fandom significance. So we did not specify every single one of these worlds, and that was on purpose. Can we talk a little bit about the different worlds and why we chose not to detail everything, Robin?
Well, obviously, I hope it's obvious, we want to leave room for game masters and groups in general to add their own worlds. This is your setting now. This is one of my big philosophies as a creator. We're making role-playing games. These worlds have to be yours once they leave the door. Now, we've got room for more inner worlds and outer worlds. It's one of the reasons that we added parallel worlds. That was Mark's brilliant idea. I'll let him detail that a little more later. I did create a couple of new worlds as examples of world creation. There's a swashbuckling techno fantasy world as an inner world with 3 different species mixing it up. The last chapter details what kind of elements we want for inner, outer, and parallel worlds. And in each of the cases, there's a canonical setting for BESM. I used the Game Screen Adventures world for an Outer World example. And for a parallel world example, Mark suggested the awesome Centauri Night setting. And just every world that BESM that has been created for BESM could fit in the BESM multiverse, in the anime multiverse somewhere. But where you put them and how you put them in should be basically what are the needs of your campaign, and there's a lot more of that in the book.
Yeah, and the great thing about how we set it up is while we detail some of the very few of the inners and outers and beyonders, we don't talk much about those because it gives that creativity. Certainly, all of the licensed anime shows and manga that, of course, we don't have the rights to do, whether it's something like Sword Art Online or The Time I Got Reincarnated by a Slime, or even more fantasy oriented, like a Cowboy Bebop, or science fiction oriented like that. You could drop any of those and have that particular world one of the canonical inners or outers or beyonders as you wish. That's best for your campaign. So it is a great way for us to provide the foundation, and certainly the 6 prime worlds was the bedrock that we wanted to have. But in terms of what canonical, it's whatever we come up with, and we haven't done that much yet. We're still just scratching the very beginning of the surface of the different settings, because we're not going to inundate nothing but setting books. I mean, there's obviously a number of different products that we need to do, and given the multiverse and given an overview that with it, just seemed like a good place to start. Moving on to some of the other questions that were asked. So one of them is the BESM Multiverse is one of the ones that were pictured in the core book. Whenever we published that back several years ago, we kind of featured the products coming up, and BESM Multiverse was there. But it was one of the last big ones. So what's next? And the person who did ask the question did ask about BESM LARP, and so that is the last one that we had mentioned. And it's something that I thought we'd have done by now, and then something happened in 2020, which kind of changed the world regarding LARPs, because, of course, it takes a lot of playtesting in groups, and it takes, to have a LARP, you have to have very large groups of people, and there was quite a while where that wasn't feasible and possible, and we're just getting back to conventions last year, for example. So BESM LARP, although it's something that I'd love to do. I think having an anime LARP system that maybe could be the foundation for lots of different anime conventions for people to use. I know there's a number of different systems people use, but I would love to have a kind of a unified one. But honestly, it got pushed back to the back burner in 2000. So still want to do it, but I have to get to some conventions to get some playtesting in, and things are kind of really up in the air on that. So the anticipation was there whenever I wrote 4th edition that we're going to do it quickly, and it just never happened yet. We've kind of moved on to other focuses, but certainly it's something I still intend to do. And then the final question on that line from that person was, what other books would you like to explore in this system? And this is something that Rob and I have talked about a lot, about what's the future beyond this, because, of course, we obviously work years or at least months, many months out on our production lines. And part of it is we needed to determine the success and the desire from the fandom. So the last Kickstarter we did for BESM was BESM Extras that we did, which was the optional rule book, and it came along with Dramatis Personae, the NPC book, and a few other accessories, and that was 2 years ago. So it's been a while, and then we moved over and we did some of the other product lines in our company, whether it's Anime 5e, Absolute Power Superhero Game, the TriStat System box sets. So we did a number of other products as well, and then, of course, global pandemic delays on supply chain issues meant that we were behind on some things, and so we didn't move as quickly as we wanted to. But 2 years later, we're finally getting back to BESM, and we weren't sure what the fandom would want. I mean, we have a pretty good active Facebook community. We have a great Discord, but we weren't sure what the uptake would be when people wanted to see. And certainly looking at the Kickstarter for BESM Multiverse, I think it's certainly been successful. It's people that are BESM fans that wanted more books like this. But in terms of what the future would hold, that's partially going to be determined by the success of this Kickstarter, and then also what the fandom wants to see. Robin, you and I have talked about the potentially going into all the different setting worlds and doing books about those and going more into detail. So while the multiverse is the entire multiverse, what if we did a book just based on Bazaroth or just based on Akaris or whatnot? Can you talk about some of the things that you could see maybe coming from the future if we went in that direction, Robin?
Yeah. Irani and Bazaroth are fascinating settings, but they're kind of the big polar superpowers of the universe too. So, Aradia campaigns can be epic, but that's romantic fantasy, and Bazaroth is the cosmic horror. And so, doing those books would be very much about the multiverse. The other four, Cathedral, Enid, Imago, Icarus, I need to pronounce that correctly, it's Icarus. Those worlds, those would be as much about the genre and getting into detail with some of the ones that we have in detail, some of the inner world stuff, some of the outer world stuff, and then just genre advice, creating your own space opera setting or your own giant robot setting, and so on. Little real talk here. I love Enid. I love psychic powers. I love giant robots. It hits me in all of my weaknesses. So, just as an example, Enid I would love to do a full book for Enid, but and obviously this would be something I would talk to Mark about. We would, if we were to do a book like this, there'd be a lot of back and forth. But I would imagine that half the book would be world expansion, building on the stuff from the core book and multiverse, and then the rest of it would be inner world, outer world, how to do your own big robot fantasy. And the exact portions would change, but it would be as much for genre, giant robots, post-apocalypse, psychic powers, as much as, well, what is there to do on Enid? Because I love Enid, but a lot of game masters are going to want to create their own worlds. So that's my vision for expansions on the books at the moment. And the other books would probably follow similar patterns. Mark, you agree?
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting because when we were doing BESM's second edition, when I was working on that line, a lot of it was expressions of genres through specific source books. So Centauri Knights, for example, written by David Pulver, that was one of my favorite BESM second edition books that we did, and it was. A setting took place in the future. Kind of the UN grows up and moves on to other worlds, and what happens when they encounter alien forces on other planets. And I thought that was a great exploration of a science fiction, closer to a harder SF setting for anime, through a setting. And that was kind of always the vision that we ended up having, because when we look at many other game companies, the big beast, obviously Dungeons and Dragons, and all the OGL content for that. We know that gamers of Dungeons and Dragons, they want a book of monsters. The number of monster books out there is huge. So people want monster books, people want magic item books or trap books. I don't think that's ever kind of been the BESM way of doing things. That's not to say that, when we did the BESM Fantasy Bestiary back for second edition, it was certainly popular and people liked it, and people have still requested that we do another monster type book. So certainly gamers do want the pre-made oppositions, certainly. But it doesn't have that item monster spell churn that other systems, which are maybe a little bit more crunchier and detailed, that the gamers would want for that. I don't think that's really been the appeal of BESM. When we look at it, even from a system point of view, so BESM core book and then BESM extras, and then there's a few extras, expansions we may have for here's an extra limiter, here's an extra defect or an extra enhancement or attribute that we might splinter through some of our other books. But once the system is done, our tri-stat system, it's kind of finished. There's not a lot you can do. Like, unlike Dungeons and Dragons, you can have a whole book of just new spells. That really doesn't play out when the system is done. And we think the tri-stat, the new version of Tri-Stat that was first started in BESM 4th edition and then has kind of refined a little bit when we did Absolute Power and Tri-Stack Core. It's kind of finished, and so we're going to have to take a look and see what this does, and let's look at some of the other Kickstarters that we have, and then determine where the future is for BESM and where we are going to do the focus to make sure that we're giving fans what they're looking for. It has to be economically viable, obviously, but it also has to capture our attention as creators. Certainly there's only so many times you want to create another item, for example. Like we could create a whole book of items, like 3, 4, 5, 600 pages. I just, that would be a very difficult thing to do, given BESM's system really doesn't, I think, encourage that type of play, especially given that it's a multiversal system. So people say, why don't you do a monster manual for BESM? It's like, well, what genre? Because a fantasy monster doesn't make sense if you're running a cathedral game, for example, or maybe it does. It can make sense, but maybe it doesn't make sense for Enid or for a parallel Earth world. So we're certainly looking at that. So that's a very long answer, I think, to that question. One of the questions that come up is that we're busy writing source materials. Do we ever get a chance to play your own games? Robin, what's going on in your RPG gaming life outside of writing for us?
Well, there's been some slowdown recently because I've been trying to juggle a couple of different other projects, because we are working on other things here at Discami. But my wife and I, we game on a semi-regular basis. We've got... Morgan, do you mind if I mention our campaigns? Yeah. We've got a Doctor Who campaign that goes on and off. There's this huge mashup of this one world that we kind of threw all of our fandoms in together. Well, not all of them. That would be infinite, but that'd be bigger than BESM Multiverse. And we threw in some a few different things from Onyx Path. That was gracious enough to give Mark the license. Thank you, Onyx Path. We game to playtest stuff. Morgan has an Absolute Power superhero. She'll be showing up in the 2021 annual as an NPC.
She's in the core book.
Yeah, she does. There's some detail of her in the core book, as she points out. That's I'll just go ahead and say that's Amrath. We just started an Anime 5e campaign. BESM Multiverse was... We were in the middle of like a few different campaigns when I was working on BESM Multiverse, which is why the BESM Multiverse one didn't quite take off at the time. But there's the seeds of that one too. So I actually roleplay as part of the character creation process, the world creation process.
It's I think you're doing in some ways a lot more than I am. Obviously we do play testing of our stuff, and I do a lot of writing. But my big gaming right now is actually Dungeons and Dragons. I do an online game with family from different places. Some my niece and nephew, my kids are involved, my wife, and so we have a chance of doing something through Roll20. Which when everyone started asking about, oh, are you going to do any VTTs for BESM? I was like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I had never done one before. And then whenever my niece wanted to play Roll20 version of D&D, I said sure, and it gave me a chance to kind of see what I liked and what I didn't like as a player to kind of use that. As people might have known, I was laid up for a good part of this year with my frozen shoulder issue that's fortunately has largely been resolved, which is great. So thanks for all the support for that one. But that did kind of take me away a little bit from gaming, so we have to get back into role-playing game. We're doing one of the adventures that I guess Wizards of the Coast provides through Roll20, and it's been kind of fun. It is what it is. D&D's near and dear to my heart. It was the first game that I ever played, and so it always has a special place for me, even though it's not the system that is the end all be all for what I want. The experience is very familiar with that. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I don't game as much as I'd like to. I do a lot of board gaming still. Certainly, it's easier to get together with friends for like an hour or two and do a board game. Role playing is a little bit more involved with that. So I'm going to move on to just some of the other questions that we had. do we still watch anime and read manga? And if so, what have we been reading or watching lately? So yeah, I mean, I know that both Robin and I are avid consumers of stuff. I say I use my Crunchyroll a fair amount, and some on Netflix as well. I guess some of the biggest ones that I'm doing right now is certainly I'm that what is it called, the simulcasting. So I try to keep up on My Hero Academia. I try to do I'm really enjoying Spy Family, which is interesting. So we went to Anime Expo as a company and had a booth, and they saw these big banners for Spy Family. I'm like, what's that? It looks stupid. I didn't know anything about it. And then I found out it was on Crunchyroll, and I watched an episode, and it is totally up my line of what I enjoy. Someone that's obviously been around with Sailor Moon and Ranma and Tenchi. I've leaned towards more the rom-com or the comedic, less serious, a little bit more pokey fun, and so I've really been enjoying Spy Family. And then whenever there's a new season of something like the time I got reincarnated by slime, I tried to catch up on that. So I have a number of different things. I'm not a big manga reader. It's never been something that has captured my attention, but anime shows, yeah, I definitely try to keep up on those. What are you into right now, Robin?
Well, I haven't been watching as much because I've been doing more reading and gaming for the writing. But I mean, I'm a huge Fairy Tail fan. I am addicted to Eden Zero. It's a Netflix. Give us the next season of Eden Zero. Black Clover I mentioned earlier. Yeah, My Hero Academia. I can't believe I spaced on it as soon as you mentioned. It's like, yeah. I love Deku. I have opinions on My Hero Academia, and I will go back and watch some of the older stuff. I came to the Gachimon fandom through Battle of the Planets. I'm sorry, and my wife's mentioning the Escaflowne and some it did Fullmetal Alchemist. So yeah, I'm kind of doing a bit of jumping back and watching old favorites because we watched the Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 series all the way through. I have not finished watching Brotherhood yet, so I've been trying to make time, but there's just not enough hours in the day. There's so much anime out there, and so much of it is good. So those are the ones I'm watching now.
And yet, there's actually also a surprising number of stuff that is just about unwatchable. So with a Crunchyroll membership, every so often I'll sit down. I was like, I'm just gonna watch something new, and I'll just flip through and see what's popular. Maybe nothing in the top 10, but because I know some of those, and just go a little bit deeper. And I'll turn on an episode, and I just feel like putting a fork in my eyes or my ears watching it. There's so much stuff that's terrible out there. I like my old school anime, and so I'm like you, Robin. I like going back and watching some old stuff. I actually just it was last year got the 52, 54 episodes of Kimagure Orange Road Core, and watched that with the family, which is like total rom-com, very little on science fiction. I mean, I love that kind of stuff. You could role play in it, but wouldn't make a good source book. And I enjoy that. But some of this new stuff, it's a lot of computer graphics I'm finding in some of the anime, which I don't find that you can do it well, but there's a lot of them that they're cheapening out. I mean, I love Miyazaki, and I love his old style of the cell shading and the hand drawn, and that's just not common anymore. So there's lots of good stuff out there, but I've seen lots of bad stuff too. So the last question that was asked outside of Twitch, and we will be moving over to some of the Twitch questions, was what are the chances of specific setting books for existing anime and manga like Hellsing and Trigun and Demon City Shinjuku that we did before? So that's about licensing, and let's just say licensing is very different than it was whenever I was with Guardians of Order, back 20 years ago. It's actually much harder now. Back 20 years ago, most of the Japanese companies had a localization company in the U.S. So, for example, stuff done through like Tenchi and Hellsing. They were done with Pioneer Entertainment US. We had Inoki Films handled Slayers, which was not the original Japanese company, but they were in New York. And of course, everyone knows Sailor Moon. Deke did the translation of that, and Deke handled all the local licensing. And so when you're dealing with North American companies like we did back 20 years ago, getting those licenses was first of all easier, and then getting approvals was also easier because you're typically getting approval not through the original Japanese company but through the localization of the North American company. So getting those approved was a lot easier, which is why we had so many licenses back in the Guardians of Order days for BESM Second Edition. Going forward 20 years now, when we looked at getting some licenses for BESM, and it has been extremely difficult because globalization means almost every company you're working with the original Japanese company, or maybe an arm through the original Japanese company. So, for example, when we did the Sailor Moon Crystal board games, we were working with that's Toei Animation, but we were working with the Toei Animation in the U.S., which is still very heavily tied to Toei Animation Japan and Kodansha and whatnot. And approvals, and to give you one example, we had the most recent Sailor Moon Crystal party game that we did. It was basically it's 1,000 questions. It's not a trivia game, it's like a party game with party type questions. It took 2.5 years of approval to get this approved for 1,000 questions. This is how difficult approvals can be when you're working with the original Japanese companies. Now, they're a lot more protective of their IPs than the way they were. That's not to say there aren't licenses. Obviously, we know if you look at the gaming industry, there's lots of board games and card games that are licensed on anime, including some of the ones we've talked about, like My Hero, and I know Japanime Games, who assists us with the distribution of our products. They have some license as well. But the problem with role-playing games versus a board game is the sheer volume. And so when we had, as I mentioned, we had the license with Sailor Moon Crystal for Toei Animation for board games and party games, and they can take quite a while to get approved. Well, we submitted a role-playing game to them for approval, and they just straight up said no. Too much work, too much text, because of course, role-playing games could have 100 to 300,000 words. Absolute Power was 500,000 words, and that's very different than a 4 or 5 page rule book written in English and then a bunch of graphic images to approve. So textual things, especially things that play in the gaming sandbox. So when you're playing with a Japanese world, something that was created in Japan, it's their IP, and then you're creating role-playing games based on that. That's kind of playing in the creator side of things versus a board game where you're just moving pieces on a board and you're not really doing the creative aspect the way, of course, we need to do when we're doing a story world. So it's been challenging. If you look at the number of anime board games and card games in North America, compare that to the number of licensed anime role-playing games. First of all, it's a smaller market. Secondly, there's not a lot of people approving things for that. And so that was make it challenging. We've had a couple opportunities. We've explored some things. Let's just say we've progressed forward on some channels, but as of this point, we haven't had the level of success that we wanted to. And the hassle of the licensing and the approvals versus when Robin creates something, he has an awesome idea and Robin can write it up, and they send it to me, and I say, hey, this is great, and then we can move ahead with it, and we don't have to worry with approvals the same way. And so that's where we're sitting about the licenses. No positive news on that front. And obviously, Robin, I know we've talked about some potential licenses that might come up and that we might have some angles on. I know that you would love to work on some of these, but it's just not in the cards at this point. So, hey, we're doing some great original stuff, and we'll continue with that for a while. I noticed there had been some thank you for the questions and the comments that have come up on the Twitch stream. So I'm just going to go through some of those, Robin, and hopefully I'll be able to stop talking and give you a chance to talk a little bit more. One of the questions from Joe Sullivan is, do you feel making in-canon worlds with their own limitations and restrictions will make some GMs less likely to build their own worlds? And would that detract from the creation process? So, Robin, what do you think? If we provide our worlds and we give them lots of world content, is that going to slow down GMs being creative?
Well, there's everybody has their own outlooks and limitations and viewpoints, but it's been my experience that having worlds out there just provides more tools. This is something I mentioned in Best of Multiverse and go into more detail on in an upcoming book. I don't know if you want me to mention any of the upcoming books after Multiverse, but my philosophy is every role playing book is a toolbox. Every role playing book is a toolkit, and if I have a thing that bugs me about other companies and role playing, and this doesn't happen often. Most companies are really good about this, but I've seen books where it's like, this isn't a toolbox, this isn't a toolkit, it's a very specific thing. It's like, dude, it's a role playing game. Once it's in the hands of the players and the GM, they can do anything they want with it. There's nothing you can do to stop them. So, from my perspective, everything I create is meant to be, here's what I've got for you, do what you want with it. Now, obviously, I could be offended by things, and just because I have very strong feelings about how treating others with respect. BESM has very strong opinions on that as well. That the company is, but unless you are hurting real life people, here's the tools. Do what you want. Like Icarus came up earlier. You want to create a D&D fantasy world that steals 2 shards of Azar and the Dragon Spine Mountains, and that's it. Well, go for it. Yeah. Our version of the ogre, our NPCs. The way I see it is that if you just a little bit of a look, and you can take anything that is written in role playing and make it your own. It doesn't take, in my opinion, a lot of creativity. Now, on the other hand, I've been told that if I have a strength, it's creating things. So I've been doing my own stuff since I was in my preteens. I would cringe if anyone tried to publish anything I wrote before I was 25 and ask, but that's a creative process, and I would say don't be intimidated by existing stuff. Use it wholesale, use it piecemeal, use it to inspire your own stuff and throw out everything that is the exact text. But don't be afraid of existing settings because they're just more stuff to mine.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question because it does seem to be instinctive that if we give everyone the worlds and we give everyone the content, will they not create their own things? And I can kind of only look at, I guess, anecdotal stuff and how my gaming history was. So back when I was in high school and early university, and I was doing pretty well exclusively Dungeons and Dragons at that time, and I would create my own D&D world that was a mishmash of all the fantasy stuff that I was into. So, Tad Williams' Dragonbone Chair and Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. And so I would create a map and I would use the names of the places in the novels and I would use some of the ideas of the different monsters for the novel. Of course, it was still D&D, so there'd be your orcs and your goblins, but now there was also Trollocs and I'd throw those in. And there was some of the elements that I would use from all the different fantasy novels that I was reading at the time. And so I found that the more content there is, the more tools it gives you to create your own stuff. And actually, in some ways, it helps. It helped me and I to be more creative by seeing the example that is there. And I'd like to think as BESM is it's anytime we give stats for characters or monsters or items, they can be used as they are, of course, at any time. You can just drop this particular mecha from BESM Multiverse into your own game. But I think one of the strengths is to show you how you can express ideas using the system and how you can express it to create an effect. And so that's why I think some of these things can actually help people be creative, which actually leads in to the next question that it was a follow-up from Joe Sullivan. And that was asking about... mentioned about, for example, the 5 senses that we have, and you can get a limiter for reduced senses, and talking about touch. So if you have a limitation on touch, does that also apply to pain? And if it's nerves, and therefore what are the implications of that? And if not, then why not? And that actually, I think, goes back to the foundation of what an effects-based system is. And so a lot of the things that we give in the game, we don't we don't tie direct mechanical benefits to it. We leave it open and we present it, but then people can decide what the effects of that are, because in an effects-based game, it's you kind of pay the points for an effect, but then you determine the expression and what the parameters of that are. So, for example, features is one of the things that comes up an awful lot in BESM. There's lots of different features, and one of the features you could have is, for example, a pouch, or nictitating membranes, or webbed feet. Now, what do they mean? Well, we don't give a strict mechanical value to all of these different things. We give you something that you can put in, and then you determine how it's going to affect the game. And of course, with any kind of parameters, like if someone says, well, I take 1 point and I have webbed feet, and therefore that's going to give me the equivalence of 3 levels of water speed. No, that doesn't quite work that way, because we do have a point-based system that we're working with, and points equals effects, and you build the effects from that system. But we leave a lot of things open interpretation. So if you have either heightened senses for touch or reduced senses for touch, what is that going to affect? We don't tell you that, well, your perception is now a -2 on perception checks if you have lower hearing, or for touch, because it affects your nerve endings, you'll feel less pain, and therefore this particular rule about pain and health points doesn't apply. We don't give those types of details in BESM. That's never been kind of the strategy that we have. We give you the overall effect, or the overall kind of description of what it is, and then you determine how that best plays out in your game. And that's how my approach to game design has been like that. I prefer games that are much more generic like that than something. Dungeons & Dragons, as an example, they'll be very specific on, well, this character has a keen sense, a keen smell, and so because they have a keen smell, this is the effect. They get an advantage on these particular rolls, and that's not something we've often brought into the game. But thanks for the question on that one. We have, just looking through the questions. Oh, okay. I'm not going to try to pronounce this person's name. It's a very difficult one to pronounce, but it said, the question is, would Discami consider publishing a black and white manga-sized edition of the rule books for BESM? Yeah, it's in that it can be more accessible and to make BESM stand out for the market for manga fans. So anyone who's been around with BESM know that that's how we started. It was a 6x9 small digest size is kind of the term that we have. I guess manga size now, but a 6x9 softcover book, and that was the BESM line in throughout first edition and second edition. The problem with that particular size, twofold. One, it does limit layout options. When I'm doing graphic design and layout, the larger the book, in some ways, the more options you have for interesting layout designs, which is usually just 2 columns, where when you get into a 6x9, that 1 or 2 columns it's more difficult. So there's a practical application, but from a sales point of view, the digest size it gets lost on the retailer shelves. And we were told by retailers back, with Guardians of Order years, 20 years ago, that the problem with our BESM line is the books are too small and they don't rack properly on their shelves compared to the majority of RPGs. So whenever you go kind of a little bit different, then you're causing some problems from a retail point of view. So something like Nobilis, which is a beautiful kind of 12 by 12 book, but it's square, that caused so many problems for companies as well. And so when we decided in third edition and moving forward to fourth edition to keep it as a standardized kind of 8.5 by 11, the standard size for hardcovers, that allows us to fit into all the other places that all the other role-playing games do. So that was our philosophy with that. Then what do we go do? Tri-Stack Core. And Tri-Stack Core flips back to the smaller manga 6x9 type size, almost back to second edition BESM. But there was a specific reason for that, and that was to create a pocket edition of the system itself. So you ask about, is there going to be a pocket-sized edition of BESM? Probably not, but TriStack Core fills that niche because the TriStack Core system is the BESM system, is the absolute power system. They are the same system. They don't have all the trappings of the anime world and the anime art. In fact, in TriStack Core, there is no art. It is just the system itself. But this allowed us to keep the cost down low. It's only $15 for an entire role-playing game. It's black and white, but it kind of is a bit of a throwback to second edition of BESM that we did, but it's also a format that wasn't going to be part of a line. We're not doing a TriStack Core line. I know, for example, Fate Core, is an RPG that has a line of stuff. TriStack Core is never intended to be the line. It is the system. Our lines are BESM and Absolute Power and our TriStack system box sets, but that does exist right now. Check out TriStack Core if you haven't already. And I see RPG Digest did actually mention it. And we talk about the level of content from BESM wasn't there. No, it wasn't. It doesn't have a lot of advice. It doesn't have the player section, GM section, all these different. And that was the essence of that, which allowed us to keep the cost down low. If anyone remembers back when we did TriStat DX, so after we did Silver Age Sentinels, then we did TriStat DX, was the stripped down version of just the rules, black and white again, similar to what we're accomplishing with Core. And that was something that we designed to kind of get the system out to more people. Obviously, books are expensive now, and inflation doesn't help. You're looking at a $40, $50, $60 buy-in for a Core book. Isn't it awesome that you can now get TriStack Core, an entire game system, for only $15? I mean, that's pretty good. And if you download it, it's $8. So